Out of Sepultura's early streak of thrash albums, Schizophrenia seems to be the one that's talked about the least. I see this usually getting little more than a passing mention in comparison to Morbid Visions or Beneath the Remains, generally called a transitional album between the two, and a glorified prototype of the latter. And to be fair, there's some truth to that. This album does not have the raw proto-black appeal and influence of the debut, nor the wider spread and streamlined aggression of the follow-up, which was actually their first album. Sepultura's take on thrash is one that concentrates on a bludgeoning guitar sound, muted chugging and tremolo riffs, explosive drumming and punishing rhythmic breaks at appropriate moments. All trademarks of their thrash sound are present here. Crushing, yet catchy riffs, chaotic shredding solos with a tinge of trad metal melodicism, and Max Cavalera's gruff, howling vocals. If you compare this to, however, there's far more to Schizophrenia than what initially meets the ear. This album's secret weapon lies not only in the increased emphasis on melody and busier riffing, To the Wall is a fine example of this, but specifically in the arrangements of the songs. You see, this album is a prime example of a songwriting approach known. Indeed, this is the final piece of the puzzle that ties it all together while also reinforcing their death thrash credentials. Though this album is already chock full of impressive riffs, they're structured in such a way that they just keep coming, hitting you from every direction and giving the songs an added air of menace, again, something that death metal would grow to rely on extensively. Songs like From the Past Comes the Storms, bonus points for the tasty English, Septic Schizo, and especially the instrumental Inquisition Symphony rely heavily not just on the impact of the riffs themselves, but on how said riffs transition into and complement each other with. This kind of sound is something Sepultura never really recaptured later in their career. Their next two albums did this too, but to a much lesser extent, only really doing something similar during dedicated middle portions. The riffs on those albums are still quite effective at wrecking your neck, but here they are arguably even more impactful, adding